Hi, this is Sydney.
And I'm Shakira.
We are True Crime from A to Z,
where we tell you the true stories of crimes about the Great White North.
Our show focuses on the crime but pays respect to the victims and their families.
We're so excited to bring our passion project to life and hope you will join us to bring light to these cases.
This is True Crime from A to Z.
On December 14th, 2017, a real estate agent arrived at a sprawling modern house near the northern edge of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, accompanied by a man and woman who were interested in buying the 12,000-square-foot mansion at 50 Old Colony Road, which had recently been listed at $6.7 million. With 5 bedrooms, 9 bathrooms, a gym, a sauna, a tennis court, and underground parking for 6 cars, it was one of the most impressive properties on a street filled with very impressive homes. The agent led the couple to the basement, which contained the house's pièce de résistance, an indoor lap pool and hot tub, perfect amenities for a house in a cold-weather city like Toronto. As the agent led the way into the pool area, the group was horrified by the discovery they made. 2 corpses lay side by side, obviously murdered in a violent manner. They had been dead for several days. From the South Shore of Lake Erie, this is Great Lakes True Crime. The murdered couple found at the sprawling mansion were the homeowners, billionaire Barry Sherman, age 75, who made his fortune in the pharmaceutical industry, and his wife Honey, age 70, and a very well-known and respected philanthropist. They had lived at the home for over 20 years and put it up for sale as they were preparing to move out and build a house closer to the Toronto city centre. Within just a few hours of the gruesome discovery, the deaths were the biggest news story in Canada. Barry Sherman was the chairman of Ep.18 Incorporated, a privately held generic drug manufacturer that he founded in the mid-1970s. It grew to be Canada's premier pharmaceutical manufacturer, accounting for as many as 20% of all Canadian prescriptions. Ep.18 was not only a huge company, but it was unusual in that it was one of the very few Canadian drug makers that hadn't been taken over by a foreign rival. With a fortune that the Bloomberg Billionaires Index placed at $3.6 billion at the time of his death, Barry was Canada's 18th richest person, and he and Honey were among the nation's most generous philanthropists, supporting a wide range of organizations including some focused on cultural and educational causes, fighting poverty, and Jewish causes, even though Barry was a staunch atheist. Barry and Honey were firmly cemented in Canadian high society, which is a very small, exclusive club. They knew all the movers and shakers, particularly because of their voracious fundraising for the governing Liberal Party. In fact, among the 6,000 mourners at a memorial service held a week after the deaths was none other than Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. A common theme among the long litany of eulogies for Barry and Honey centered on perplexity as to why anyone would want to kill 2 people whose, quote, humanity knew no bounds, unquote, as Toronto Mayor John Tory put it. How could the lives of a couple at the height of society, with all their fame, notoriety, and wealth, come to such a horrific, violent end? Initial reports signified that police were not looking for a murder suspect and had found no evidence of forced entry into the home. According to the Shermans' adult children, those reports suggested police believed the deaths were the result of a murder-suicide, with Barry Sherman killing his wife and then himself. Not surprisingly, the Shermans' children were appalled by that suggestion. They released a statement saying, "We are shocked and think it's irresponsible that police sources have reportedly advised the media of a theory which neither the family, their friends, nor their colleagues believe to be true." Toronto homicide detective Brandon Price met with reporters outside the Sherman home and reported that police cannot say with 100% certainty whether foul play was involved or suspected. Detective Price said there were no signs of forced entry and that police were not searching for any suspects. 10 months after the Shermans' deaths, investigations continued to be carried out by the police, as well as a team of private detectives hired by the couple's 4 adult children. The crime scene presented a series of contradictions and confusing signs. There was no evidence of a break-in, and the killings appeared to be personal, even perhaps intimate. The official cause of death for both was ligature neck compression, meaning strangulation by a cord or belt, which would be painful and terrifying. It's the type of homicide where the killer didn't want to just kill the victims, but to see them suffer in the process. On the other hand, the crime scene was extremely tidy, with very little evidence left behind. This would suggest the work of a professional. Many theories were thrown out there, with people speculating that the killings could be attributed to rival drug makers, disgruntled ex-employees, or even Russian or Israeli gangsters. Barry grew up in Toronto, sometimes going to work in a factory with his father, until his father sadly passed away while Barry was only 10 years old. He would grow up to be a relatively awkward, not much of an athlete, but an exceptional student. He had a penchant for arguing with religious friends about what he believed to be the folly of believing in God. Barry majored in engineering physics at the University of Toronto because, as he explained in his unpublished memoir, it was supposedly the most difficult subject. That's the kind of guy Barry was, always up for a challenge. His first foray into the pharmaceutical industry was when he worked as a driver for his uncle Lewis Winter, who ran a generic drug distribution company named Empire Laboratories. A lot of Barry's runs were actually to pick up urine samples for pregnancy tests. He left that job when he enrolled in an engineering doctoral program at MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It was there, at MIT, that he got word his Uncle Lewis had died suddenly. Rather than breaking Barry's spirit, it actually fueled his ambition. Barry was so confident in his abilities to run his uncle's company that he came up with an acquisition plan for Empire Laboratories. So he bought the company, and while learning the ropes of drug production, he met and married Honey, who was the daughter of Holocaust survivors. Honey was a tough cookie. She was born in a displaced persons camp before eventually emigrating to Canada as a child. After Barry successfully ran his uncle's old company for about 5 years, he agreed to sell it for a very large profit, and eventually used that money to fund the creation of Apotex. The concept of the generic drug business is pretty simple. You sell cheaper, chemically identical substitutes for name brand drugs. The name brands do all the research and marketing, and you sell the generic for a lower price, but with much lower overhead costs. Some years back, I actually worked in a pharmaceutical production facility where we made liquid injectable drugs. As I learned firsthand, sometimes generic drugs are exactly the same as the name brand drugs. The only difference was the label we put on the vials. But generic drugs took a while to be accepted, both by consumers and the government. Name brand drugs are protected by patents that keep generic drug makers from copying them until the patent expires. Through the early 1980s, patents were heavily protected and left very little room for generic drug makers to produce copies. That all changed in 1984 when the U.S. Congress passed the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act, more commonly known as the Hatch-Waxman Amendments. This law allowed generic drug makers to more easily challenge patents in court before they expired and, if successful, to enjoy a very lucrative period of exclusive sales. Barry was keenly aware of this change in drug laws and was very eager to get a piece of the world's largest pharmaceutical market. In fact, he was one of the most aggressive users of this new system. Barry was said to have a tremendous ability to uncover the vulnerabilities in brand-name drug patents. His company, Apotex, was one of the first companies to make a generic version of AZT, the earliest widely effective treatment for HIV. He later took to market a generic version of the extremely popular antidepressant Prozac. Barry quickly became one of his prominent businessmen, but stayed somewhat socially awkward. Honey, on the other hand, developed a wide and active circle of friends. Barry was almost incapable of making small talk and would frequently be found working away even on weekends or while on family vacations. He was extremely generous to his employees, even quietly giving them extra money if they had financial troubles, and he provided very well for his family. But Barry didn't spend much money on himself. He would drive modest cars and drive them into the ground. One time he kept driving an old, rattling Ford Mustang so long that one of his friends worried it might be leaking carbon monoxide into the cab. Needless to say, making knockoff copies of name-brand drugs, even though it was legal, did not make Barry many friends at the large pharmaceutical companies. In private, executives of rival drug companies describe Barry in terms that are too obscene for me to repeat here. At one point in the 1990s, according to two people with knowledge of the matter, Germany's Bayer AG became convinced that Barry was infringing its patents, so they hired private investigators to recruit Apotex employees as informants, and even raised the possibility of planting a stash of illegal drugs in his car. Now, in their defense, Bayer said that it has never called on employees or external service providers to obtain information in a criminal manner, and that any use of illegal methods would have occurred without the company's knowledge or authorization. Still, plenty of businessmen are alpha males that like to play hardball. What made Barry unique was his habit of entering into side businesses with people who were a bit out of the corporate mainstream. In one instance, he attempted to invest in a yacht chartering venture, but as Barry would soon learn, the venture had no yachts and only shell companies, leading the creators of the scheme to be convicted of fraud. Barry later became the largest shareholder of Nutrition for Life Incorporated, a multi-level marketer of vitamin supplements whose pitchman, Kevin Trudeau, no relation to the Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, was a twice-convicted felon who frequently found himself the subject of criticism, accusations of fraud, and civil lawsuits. Kevin Trudeau is currently an inmate in a U.S. federal prison after having been convicted of criminal contempt. He'll be eligible for parole in 2022. During the time period that would ultimately be near the end of his life, Barry was linked to Sean Rutenberg, another con artist who was working to develop an online trivia game. Barry agreed to invest in the venture, but later alleged to court that his investment money had disappeared. According to legal filings, Barry had been connected to Rutenberg by Myron Gottlieb, the co-founder of a theater production company that collapsed in a famous Canadian accounting scam. It turned out that Gottlieb and Rutenberg had met in prison. Barry was linked to a couple other shady characters in his business dealings, and friends tried to warn him to use caution in his business dealings. Barry, however, seemed to crave the attention from the many characters who wanted a piece of his fortune. As loyal and helpful Barry was to people he liked and trusted, he was equally savage to those that crossed him. He was an exceptionally tough and voracious litigant, sometimes involved in as many as 50 simultaneous actions. Many of them related to generic drugs, but quite a few focused on other issues as well. Honey Sherman arrived at Apotek's headquarters, located just off a busy freeway in the outskirts of Toronto, late on the afternoon of December 13th, 2017. It was one of the last days she planned to be in the city before heading to the couple's vacation home in Florida. Barry was scheduled to join her in Florida later that December. Her visit to Apotek's headquarters was personal. She was to meet with the builders of their new house in Forest Hill, a central neighborhood that's home to many of Canada's business elite. Barry didn't really want to move out of their sprawling suburban mansion, but Honey was determined to have a dream home built closer to Toronto's social scene. The old house on the lot they purchased in Forest Hill had already been demolished so construction could begin. Honey came home that evening before Barry, who frequently worked at his office well into the night. Colleagues received a routine email from Barry that evening about a drug Apotek's had in development, but nothing else super out of the ordinary happened except that no one at the company heard from Barry overnight. Although overnight communications might be unusual for most people, it wasn't for Barry because he often had trouble sleeping. On a side note, I frequently have trouble sleeping at night as well, but I never send work emails when that happens. I do what any normal person would do. I put on Netflix, look for some Republic of Doyle reruns, and hope a Garrison Steele episode comes up. Anyway, what was truly unusual is that Barry, the workaholic, did not show up at his office the next day, which was Thursday. Honey was nowhere to be found that day either. Toronto police responded to the 911 call from the real estate agent at 11:44 a.m. on Friday. Initially, police reported only that 2 people had been found dead in the house. An Ontario provincial police official confirmed on Twitter later that day that the deceased people were in fact the Shermans. Police told journalists gathered in the snow outside the old Colony Road house that there were no indications of forced entry and that they weren't seeking any suspects. On Saturday, Canadian media reported that the deaths were being treated as a possible murder-suicide committed by Barry Sherman. As we said earlier, the Shermans' adult children, Lauren, aged 43, Jonathan, aged 35, Alexandra, aged 32, and Kaylin, aged 27, were flabbergasted and outraged by the insinuation. Later that Friday, the siblings issued a statement saying their parents' characters were totally inconsistent with the rumors regrettably circulated in the media, and urged police to conduct a thorough, intensive, and objective criminal investigation. The idea that Barry would be a murderer did seem strange, not only because of his demeanor, but also due to his physical capacity. Friends surmise, half-jokingly, that if the couple were involved in a murder-suicide, it would more likely have been the other way around. The Sherman children retained the services of respected Toronto attorney Brian Greenspan to represent their interests. Greenspan's past clients included Justin Bieber and Naomi Campbell. Greenspan assembled a team of retired police detectives to conduct a separate investigation and began pushing back publicly against the idea that the absence of broken windows or locks meant the Shermans were alone when they died. There were certainly other possible methods to enter the house, which had 9 entrances. Friends said the couple would think nothing of opening the front door for a stranger who rang the bell. With the house being up for sale, there was also an outdoor lockbox with a key inside to allow real estate agents to show the house to prospective buyers while no one else was home. The house had only one surveillance camera, and it was actually in the pool area. Unfortunately, it hadn't been functional for some time, perhaps even years. Aside from the attorney, the family brought on a pathologist to conduct second autopsies of the bodies. Among the findings that struck investigators as most significant were narrow markings on both victims' wrists, which was evidence that although no bindings were found at the scene, their hands had been tied at some point. Also a bit odd was the position of Barry's legs, which were crossed in front of his body in a way that certainly did not suggest a suicide. The private investigators presented to police their conclusion that a murder-suicide couldn't be what happened. More than a month after the bodies were found, police officially adopted that viewpoint as well. On January 26, 2018, Detective Susan Gomez told reporters that police were now describing the case as a double homicide investigation and that both Honey and Barry Sherman were in fact targeted. Police have been very tight-lipped about the investigation since that time, largely refusing to answer media questions or volunteer any new information. Because of that, there's been no shortage of speculation about what could have happened. It seems that everyone is a suspect in someone's eye. After all, Barry had cost his competitors billions of dollars over the decades. Many also point to his affinity for engaging in inadvisable financial relationships. One person who likely had a motive to confront Barry at the time of his murder was his estranged cousin, Carrie Winter. Carrie and his siblings were the children of Lewis, who had hired Barry to work at Empire Laboratories back in the 1960s, back when he was in graduate school. The Winters siblings spent much of the last 10 years of Barry's life fighting Barry in court, claiming that he hid a provision in his agreement to acquire Empire that would have allowed the Winter siblings to buy 20% of the company's shares. They also argued that Apotex wouldn't have existed without Empire to build upon, and that they should therefore receive the same proportion of Apotex, or the cash equivalent. The judge, however, disagreed. He threw out the Winters' claim, finding that Barry had acted properly, and if there had been any provisions regarding the buying of up to 20% of the shares of Empire, that deal disappeared with the sale of Empire. Aside from losing the lawsuit against Barry, the timing of the ruling led to a lot of suspicion about Carrie potentially being involved in the murder, and Carrie certainly understood that. After Barry sold Empire, the four Winter siblings lost touch with Barry for quite some time, a number of years in fact. When they got back in touch in 1988, Carrie and his brother Dana were both struggling with drug addiction. When Barry learned of their struggles, he was very generous in helping them out. He provided funding to try to help them get clean and to bankroll some business ventures. Carrie eventually did get clean, he got married, and went to work building homes. He developed a close relationship with Barry along the way. Dana was unable to turn his life around and ultimately died of a heroin overdose in 1995. It's been reported that Barry's financial help was very substantial. According to court filings, Carrie alone received about $8 million over the years. Carrie went so far as to say that Barry became a substitute father of sorts, filling the void left by Lewis's death. Eventually, though, Carrie and the siblings grew suspicious of Barry's motives. They began seeking documentation from the sale of Empire and became convinced that he owed them far more. Carrie's feelings about Barry took a 180-degree turn. He felt that Barry was bribing him and that he began to hate Barry. The Winter siblings sued Barry in 2007, but Barry fought back hard. The first thing he did was cut off his cousins financially, and then countersued to recover the financial assistance he had provided. Carrie later admitted, quote, "When I sued him, I broke his effing heart," unquote. He also acknowledged that he had motive and plenty of opportunity to kill Barry, but swore that he was not the murderer. He had an alibi for the night of the murder, which the authorities apparently have accepted, since he's still free after lengthy interviews. As for a theory, Carrie Winter is convinced that Barry himself is guilty, and it actually was a murder-suicide. He stated that Barry had a terrible temper, so it's not hard for him to believe that. Carrie even claims that in the 1990s, Barry asked him to help kill Honey. Carrie states that his reaction was incredulous, yet he went so far as asking an acquaintance to help out with setting up a hit before Barry called it off. The Sherman children released a statement regarding this allegation, stating that they were deeply hurt, shocked, and angered by Carrie's claims, which they called outrageous and baseless. Since Barry's death, it has not been easy for normalcy to return to Apotex. both because of the loss of Barry, but also because the generic drug industry has fallen on really tough times. With the demand for lower prices on the consumer side and increased competition on the supply side, much of it comes from low-cost producers in India. Barry never took outside investments in Apotex, so at the time of his death he owned more than 90% of Apotex shares. Those shares have been passed on to the Sherman children, none of whom are involved in the pharmaceutical business. Many people expect the children to sell the business either to a rival drug maker or to a private equity firm. But if any decisions have been made regarding the future of Apotex, they've not been made public. Even while Barry was alive, Kay said the plan was eventually he'd have to sell the business, and we'd sell to someone that would keep the jobs in Canada. We'd even take less money for the right guarantees, at least for a few years. The Shermans' influence can still be felt throughout Toronto. At the Art Gallery of Ontario, for example, you can still visit the Honey and Barry Sherman Gallery. They are interred in a Jewish cemetery in the Toronto area. The Sherman murders are still unsolved, and as every day passes, it looks a little less likely that anyone will be held accountable for the heinous crimes. In December 2019, 2 years after the murders, police issued a public plea for information related to the case. Since the Sherman bodies were discovered, investigators have interviewed 243 witnesses, submitted 150 items for forensic testing, and served 73 judicial warrants. Police combed through massive amounts of information, but it seems they're no closer to making an arrest. The Sherman family offered a $10 million reward and kept private investigators on the case during that time as well. The private investigation was called off, however, also in December 2019, so police alone are carrying on the investigation. You've been listening to Great Lakes True Crime. This is Steve, your host. If you like the show, please give us a positive review on your podcast app. Also follow us on Twitter or Facebook. Just search for Great Lakes True Crime. Thanks for listening, guys.